Hello, my name is Natalie Brunson Wheeler, Law Department Counsel with State Farm Insurance, based in Bloomington, Illinois. I would first like to commend the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's CEO and President, Tanya Veazey, the CBCF leadership team, and all the hardworking staff for making this event possible. On behalf of nearly 77,000 State Farm agents and employees, we are pleased to sponsor the 2021 Annual Legislative Conference and privileged to partner with the Foundation to inspire leaders through scholarship support, policy research, and sponsorship of the Communication Internship Program. We are extremely excited to be the sponsor of this critical panel discussion, Autonomous Vehicles and Transportation Equity. State Farm has a long history of helping build stronger and safer communities and actively supporting technology developments that improve auto and highway safety. We are proponents of advancements that enhance automobile safety and have participated in a number of auto technology research opportunities across the country. As the nation's #1 auto insurer, transportation issues impacting safety are critical to our core business. Transportation and infrastructure issues are at the forefront of many local and national policy discussions, and we believe it is important to have meaningful conversations around these topics. We understand that transportation equity is an important component to successful diversity and inclusion efforts. At State Farm, we are committed to these principles as they lead our organization and the manner in which we conduct business. We believe we are stronger and better when we seek the broadest perspectives, invite fresh new ideas, and encourage healthy, respectful dialogue. These beliefs are core to who we are as an organization and encompass all aspects of our business. Connecting diverse communities within urban centers is critical to long-term health and growth. We at State Farm seek to do all we can to foster those connections. I would like to thank the members of this esteemed panel for contributing their time and expertise to these important topics, and I look forward to hearing meaningful dialogue that can lead to effective solutions. Thank you again for the invitation to be a part of this truly special event.
Good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Patrice Johnson, the Vice President for the Center for Policy Analysis and Research and Leadership Institute for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. And I am pleased to welcome you to this year's very special Transportation Equity Session, stewarded by our very own fellow, Dr. Reagan Patterson, and sponsored by State Farm. This year's topic is autonomous vehicles. I've had a chance to dialogue with the scholars and innovators for this session, and we are surely in for a treat. The goal is to always advance the global Black community through research and policy, and with their unique insight, we are surely going to meet the mark. Before we jump into the conversation, it is my honor to introduce Representative Lisa Blount Rochester. Congresswoman Rochester represents the first state, Delaware, in the U.S. House of Representatives and serves as the Assistant Whip for House Leadership. Rep. Rochester sits on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. The committee has broad jurisdiction over healthcare, the environment, energy policy, manufacturing, and consumer protection. The Congresswoman is a leading voice in Congress on economic and future of work-related issues. As former Secretary of Labor and State Personnel, Lisa leverages her professional experience to advocate for legislation that boosts startup business growth and removes barriers for citizens. Please welcome Representative Lisa Blount Rochester.
Good morning, everyone. I am so honored to welcome you to this virtual session on autonomous vehicles and transportation equity, sponsored by State Farm. This session is brought to you as part of the 2021 Annual Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's Annual Legislative Conference, of which I am proud to serve as a co-chair. While we can't be together in person for this year's conference, the entire CBCF is excited to bring you a host of incredibly informative and instructive conversations brought to you in this innovative format. And this year, as the Congressional Black Caucus celebrates 50 years of serving as the conscience of the Congress, the ALC will serve as an opportunity to celebrate our Black excellence unparalleled as we press onward in power. And pressing onward in power has been so much of what the past year and a half has been about. From the COVID-19 pandemic, to the murder of George Floyd, to the insurrection of our Capitol, these past many months have shown a light on the inequities so many of us already knew existed and put them in stark display for those who did not see. That's why the Congressional Black Caucus has used this past year to amplify our power and our message. We've used this moment to advocate and advance policies that put equity at the center of all that we do. And that's why I'm also so excited to have the chance to offer opening remarks for this legislative session on autonomous vehicles and transportation equity. As the founder and co-chair of the first of its kind bipartisan Congressional Future of Work Task Force, automation is at the center of so much of the work that I do. From the COVID-19 pandemic to the murder of George Floyd to the insurrection of our Capitol, these past many months have shown a light on the inequities so many of us already knew existed and put them in stark display for all to see. That's why the Congressional Black Caucus has used this year to amplify our power and our message. We've used this moment to advocate and advance policies that put equity at the center of all that we do. And that's why I'm also so excited to have the chance to offer opening remarks for this legislative session on autonomous vehicles and transportation equity. As the founder and co-chair of the first of its kind bipartisan Congressional Future of Work Caucus, automation is at the center of so much of the work that I do. In fact, it was my belief when I founded the caucus just a few short years ago that automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, these would be forces that drove our changing economy. Instead, the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated so many of those economic changes that were well underway and forced us to adapt and to adjust. From distance learning to remote work to telehealth, the COVID-19 pandemic made it clear the future of work is now. And we know that one of the largest areas of both opportunity and anxiety is around automation and autonomous vehicles. One of the reasons I started the caucus and have focused on policies that promote equity is because we also know that the jobs at the highest risk of automation are disproportionately occupied by Black Americans. In fact, 7 of 10 of the most common professions for Black Americans are currently at risk for automation. We know that among those positions, also truck drivers and bus drivers are at risk. But we also know there's opportunity. These are the same Americans who already served on the front lines of the pandemic and were the backbone of our economy during the crisis. And so our challenge is this: how do we innovate equitably? How do we ensure that the future of work works for everyone? How do we make sure that we implement the proper policies, promulgate the right regulations, and collect the necessary metrics and data to ensure equity? How do we ensure our equitable transportation system for all? We have an amazing panel assembled today to answer those questions and more. And I hope that you're as excited to hear about them as I am as we continue our week of critical policy conversations and as we continue to celebrate Black excellence unparalleled, pressing onward in power. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Representative Rochester, thank you for your words, your time, and your wisdom. We truly appreciate you gracing us this morning. To move forward in the conversation, I am very excited to have facilitating Dr. Richard Ezekiel. Richard started out as a chemical engineer by trade, but interestingly enough, fell into transportation by chance when he received a fellowship at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. He then realized the importance of transportation to the livelihood of underrepresented communities and committed himself to working in this space with the hopes of promoting the voices of those who were underserved. What a phenomenal person to lead this discussion. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Richard Ezekiel.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Johnson, and I'm glad to be here to facilitate this great discussion on autonomous vehicles and transportation equity. As I mentioned, I've been involved in this work for a number of years, started initially with my work at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. I've also served at this work at the United Concerned Scientists and at the Urban Institute before currently my current work as a policy advisor for the EV Hybrid Noir nonprofit foundation, which focuses on electric vehicles and promotion of equity. So glad to be here and I look forward to the discussion. So let's go ahead and get started. I will have do the introductions for our panelists and then we'll go right into discussion. So first, we have Dr. Marcus Casey, who was an associate professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago and non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Casey, say hello.
Good morning, Dr. Ezekiel.
Next, we have Dr. Timnit Gebru, who's the co-founder of Black in AI.
Hello.
We have Darnell Grisby, who's the executive director of Transform.
Good morning. Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Corey Harper, who was an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University.
Good morning, everyone.
Last but not least, we have Dr. Edgar Patterson, who is the Transportation Equity Research Fellow at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation.
Hello, hello.
Great. Thank you, panelists, and truly appreciate your time and look forward to this discussion. So let's get right into the questions. So our first question, I would like to direct to Dr. Gebru. This question says, racial bias in artificial intelligence has garnered a lot of attention due to its use in such broad applications. What are the particular concerns and some of the implications for use in the transportation sector? Dr. Gebru, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this question.
I was co-leading a team called the Ethical AI team. And one of the things I was trying to study was how computer vision systems, pedestrian detection systems, so systems that detect whether a person or somebody exists on the road and not identify who they are, but just detect them. I was trying to study open source systems and data sets just to see if there's any variation. Because the thing is, a lot of automated systems have to recognize who's around. And if they don't recognize certain things as humans or vice versa, there can be a huge issue, right? An accident. And the systematic errors could be by many different characteristics. It doesn't have to be just by skin tone, but it could be, who knows, by garment. It could be by just various characteristics that trip up some of the visual systems. And so I was very worried about that. But the thing is, a lot of the companies working on this, including Waymo, is also very sensitive to any headline that might come out about this. So they were sort of not very happy that I wanted to look into it and kind of were preventing me from doing it. But I'll just finish saying that because of this risk, it's very important that these systems are available for outside researchers to study, which is currently not the case.
Thank you for those remarks, Dr. Gebru. Much appreciated. Okay, next question. I'd like to go to Dr. Or actually, before we move on to the next question, is there other people that would like to follow up on Dr. Gebru's remarks regarding racial bias from artificial intelligence? Okay, great.
I think this is an important issue. I just wanted to follow up. I think it's a very important issue to sort of, center on insofar as from a policy perspective. This is something that, sort of policymakers should also be taking a look at, right? So while I agree that there should be sort of more open source use in training, the sort of training data sets that they use to actually build these machine learning algorithms. One way to ensure that is by having sort of a more uniform set of regulations rather than piecemeal regulations. And this is going to be a hallmark of some of my comments, is that this is where the federal government can step in and ensure that sort of thing, because this is a general public safety issue.
Thank you.
And I guess to add, to jump off that point around public safety, excuse me, and how autonomous vehicles are thought of or promoted because of issues of public safety, the question around racial bias in the artificial intelligence, and also racial bias in kind of the surveillance and how these images are captured, how will they be used? So when we talk about public safety, we have to be very expansive in how we talk about public safety and autonomous vehicles. Who has access to that surveillance data that's coming from the images that are being captured? We already know that Black communities are over-policed, hyper-policed. And so Dr. Casey brought up public safety. So I also just want to bring in the racial justice implications also in policing of Black communities. And then driving makes us safer, but safer for whom? What will autonomous vehicles do in terms of we're no longer the ones driving, so will we be the ones stopped by police? And so when we talk about policy, it needs to be racial bias in the artificial intelligence and how the data is being used in policing and how policing will change because we are no longer the drivers. So I just want to add those.
So I just want to add one thing. So I know that you all have been talking about the public sector. I think we need to put some onus on the private sectors too, right? I think that the fact that they can't recognize certain clothing, certain people, Google has this thing where they talked about, I don't know, how 10 million miles of driving with autonomous vehicles. I wonder how many of those miles have been in underserved communities, where the infrastructure, probably aren't in some of the best conditions, so, when, you're talking about an autonomous vehicle meets a certain safety standard, we have to make sure that it's been encountering, a wide variety of conditions, not just those that you'd see in, the more affluent neighborhoods, but that, these vehicles are also driving in your underserved neighborhoods to minimize some of these negative consequences. So.
All great points. All great points. Dr. Casey, I'll direct this next question to you. During the pandemic, transportation layoffs provided a preview of labor reductions that will result from autonomous vehicles. What policies in employment, healthcare, education, and et cetera should you prioritize today to ensure the health, well-being, and future of work for our communities?
Well, I mean, so first and foremost, you should think of the COVID-19 pandemic as an extreme version of any sort of economic shock that might have, sort of hit an industry. And in a lot of these layoffs and things of that nature, one of the things that was brought home during the pandemic, not just in the transportation sector, but in a lot of sort of our essential worker sectors, is that, we have a serious social insurance problem, right? So if you think about sort of the advent of, in this case, autonomous vehicles, we expected, for example, Representative Rochester mentioned earlier, the effects on, say, bus drivers and taxi drivers. But I think, in general, there are a lot of driving occupations that might be affected in the future by the advent of autonomous vehicles. And the first thing that we need to think about from a policy perspective is the holes in our social insurance system. So for example, we saw a lot of workers, particularly those who were working for like Uber or Lyft, sort of fall between the cracks, so to speak, in the unemployment insurance system. And so that's one place where we, if we think that autonomous vehicles is going to disrupt that occupation, then we need to be mindful that many of these people not necessarily don't have payments or W-2s and things of that nature that would ensure that they qualify for unemployment insurance. The same thing for a lot of our other, redistributive type programs like Medicaid, EITC, and so on and so forth. So I think, if we think that autonomous vehicles are going to have a disruptive effect on, say, long haul truckers, Uber and Lyft drivers and things of that nature, we need to ensure, for people currently involved with those occupations, that they can access in the short term, if they happen to lose their jobs or lose substantial business because of autonomous vehicles, that they can access the social insurance program. But in the long term, allow them, access to training and other types of education that would allow them to sort away from those occupations and into new occupations. I think that's going to be vital, because I don't think we're going to stop the march of technology or innovation in our society. So we need to be mindful of those most affected in that way.
Mhm. A follow-up question, Marcus, you talked about the importance of those training programs and workforce development programs to help people who are in these jobs that are potentially at risk for automation. Can you talk about any examples or discussions that have happened either at any of the government levels about how these programs could look like? Is there any discussions or any pilot programs that are out there that can help train those who maybe have disrupted jobs?
Sure. I mean, of course, most states have various workforce training programs. For me, I think part of the problem and the reason why, we can't really, they're very piecemeal and they sort of stand alone. And I think one of the things that, a revision of policy or updated policy could do in this space is to actually sort of partner with the private sector to figure out where best to sort of allocate those human resources. I think, one of the problems in the past, and so many of my colleagues would be pessimistic about workforce training programs and things of that nature, but often those programs stood sort of disconnected to, what the private sector was doing. I think this is the time in which when the private sector, so going back to what Corey Harper just said, about putting the onus on the private sector to involve itself. If they know they're going to disrupt these industries and they know there's going to be an adoption, the government should step in and say, look, let's partner and see where we can reallocate some of those human resources and let's build the programs to actually do that. And we have, one of the things that I think for autonomous vehicles relative to other types of technological innovation is that we actually have time, as noted by Dr. Jabru, that, if they can't get these safety issues right together right now, and there isn't sort of uniform public policy, we're probably pretty far off from a full-scale takeover of many of these industries. And so we can start making the necessary policy moves now, in anticipation of what's to come, say, when autonomous vehicles are fully able to get out there and the infrastructure is built to really take over many of these industries. And we still have a number of years out, so we could actually do something now to start facilitating that.
Thank you.
May I add?
Please.
Yeah, so I want to emphasize the need to start thinking about these policies now. And then going back to why the pandemic is so important as providing a preview. So we see that the unemployment rate, the disparity in unemployment rates between Black and white folks has expanded since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. And there's a slower recovery for Black Americans. And a lot of this has to do with, as Representative Rochester said, with the fact that Black people are overrepresented in occupations that had huge job losses and are slower to recover. And one of those occupations are driving occupations. And so we're starting to see recovery in driving occupations it is being driven by the trucking industry because that bounced back. I mean, I know I'm ordering stuff almost every day. So folks are out here ordering things. So trucking occupations came back, but public transit has not, that has been slower to recover. But when we talk about autonomous vehicles, trucking is going to be one of the earliest adopters of automation. And so I think it's important to highlight what's happened during coronavirus, because what is going to happen when those trucking occupations are gone? And it is far out, but policies need to happen now, because we see that policies tend to be slow in terms of responding to technological advances and not being proactive about technological advancements. And so I want to emphasize also the education piece. I think we need to start the education piece now. Careers in tech pathways, investing in that. We've seen since the Great Recession, we've seen reductions in state funding for public education. We've seen that HBCUs, which disproportionately graduate Black graduates in STEM, have been systematically underfunded. And so these need to happen now to ensure that there are career pathways. Apprenticeship programs need to be funded now. Only 1% of apprenticeship programs are in professional, scientific, and technological services. And so what are we doing about that now? And so there is a policy piece that wants to increase funding for apprenticeship programs, but all of these investments need to happen now if we're going to see transition, be able to aid the transition. So as well as the social service programs that need to be supported, including childcare for folks who are transitioning, including expanded Medicaid for folks, including UBI. I'm not an economist, so I don't know the feasibility of UBI, but things like basic income, those things, we need to be talking about them now because automation is coming. And so what are we going to do now?
I just wanted to add really quickly, you hit almost all the points, because that's what what I was going to say is that, yes, we need to re-educate, but time and time again, I think what we've seen in history and what I learned from tech historians is that there's a huge link between the automation, etc., and labor movements that happen and the suppression of these labor movements. And we're seeing this again, right? So trucking, Waymo, which is the Google, Alphabet's company, the little cars that you see around. They just put out trucks in Texas, right? And the truck drivers were pushing back. And in terms of surveillance, truck drivers are sort of treated like robots already, with so much kind of surveillance of their body. And Amazon workers are already sort of treated like robots, and so we can do a lot, I think, with the regulation that even already exists. If we can strengthen the anti-discrimination laws or the institutions that we already have, I think we could already do a lot, right? So Michael Tubbs in Stockton, Mayor Stockton, tried universal basic income with great outcomes. So if we can strengthen the social safety nets that we have for people, I think that can still do a lot. So yeah, that's all I wanted to add.
Thank you for those remarks. 100% agree with all that. That's great to hear. All right, Dr. Harper, I want to direct this next question to you. How could automated vehicles address issues of spatial mismatch and improve access to fresh fruits and job opportunities for low-income and underserved communities?
Sure. So one way I think it can do that is personal delivery devices, right? So I'm sure I've been watching the NBA Finals. Every time I see a Domino's commercial come on, they have Neuro, right? Neuro is like a delivery robot. And in Pittsburgh, they have Starship Technologies, right? So these vehicles, they take food from, your grocery store or some fast food place, and they bring it to you, right? So, right now, about 23 million people live in food deserts in the country, right? And the majority of these people are low income and minority communities, right? So these people are adversely impacted, and this impacts their ability to achieve upward economic mobility, right? They're in the hospital, they're getting sicker. So, a greater, they make less, but a good portion of the income is going to have to now be spent on medicines and all these other things, right? So I think that this technology could help to increase access to jobs, fresh foods, especially by providing a reliable and hopefully a less expensive way sourcing foods, right? So right now, if you live a mile or two away from a grocery store, you might have to take the bus there. That might take 30 minutes. It might take long on weekends, because there's not any peak hour times. The bus doesn't run as frequent. Catching a TNC is going to be expensive, and you never know how much it's going to cost. If you try to take it, during rush hour times, it's going to cost $30 for a 2-mile ride, and then walking, some people, this isn't feasible for some people, especially if you have a disability or something like that, right? So, what I think it can do is provide a way for people to easily get online, order food or order fresh food and have it brought to their house. But and this is something we have to be careful of. Like right now, we're doing a study looking at infrastructure conditions and how this could impact access to fresh foods. Right. We say this, right, but a lot of the cost of autonomous vehicle is the sensing, right? So if, you don't have good infrastructure conditions, you'll need more sensors to be able to navigate more complex environments. So policymakers would need to think about how to price the curb to make this more accessible to low-income areas. But but this is one way I think that we can address some of the spatial mismatches in some of these underserved communities.
I'd like to add to that. One of the ways we can address the spatial mismatch is to actually invest in public transit when it comes to this new technology. One of the ways we can do that is through autonomous shuttles, which could be deployed in food deserts and areas that are hard to serve with transit because of the structure of those communities. So imagine communities with lower density that might be harder to serve, but public transit can be done so through autonomous shuttle, which could connect them, in fact, to the backbone of the transit system. And that way you provided access to a lot more people to the backbone of the entire transportation network.
Mm-hmm. Great points. And it's interesting, I wanted to direct a question to you, Mr. Musabin, and it kind of relates to public transit and autonomous vehicles. This is more focused on connecting organizations and people and the community engagement piece of this topic of autonomous vehicles and equity. So I wanted to ask you, how can we connect with the appropriate organizations, and we being policymakers, advocates, those who have a say in how this system is going to be developed over the next few years? How can we connect with the appropriate organizations to uplift communities that are traditionally some of the last to benefit from emerging technologies such as AVs, and ensure that these communities receive equitable deployment and access to autonomous vehicles?
I think one of the core ways is to understand the impact on land use and parking. For example, if we can find a way to deploy these technologies through shared electric fleets, we can actually make it much easier to reduce parking minimums. Parking minimums are oftentimes requirements that we place on developers that says they must have X number of parking spaces per unit of housing. Now that cost gets brought over to the renter or the person buying the home. So one of the ways to ensure equity is to try to push for regulatory structures that encourage the rollout of these technologies in a fleet of shared vehicles. One of the ways we can actually address this is to talk to community about how we can actually reappropriate the land use to be more equitable. My organization has done a lot of work around parking, because parking minimum requirements actually have been a way to keep Black folks out of communities. So we can actually expand access to opportunity also by addressing this directly. So part of it will have to be through education. It's a two-way street. So ensuring that community organizations understand the power of this technology that can transform the community, but could also do so in a negative way that we saw with the advent of the automobile decades ago and the use of freeways that tore through our communities. So we need to make sure that these community organizations are ready to make sure that these types of investments don't have a deleterious impact once again in our communities, to make sure they're ready to actually say, we want this deployed through electric shared fleets. We want to make sure that land use can actually catch up with it. We want to make sure that public transit is not forgotten. One of the ways this could go horribly wrong is if we compete directly with some of the best routes that public transit has to offer. Like, for example, in my hometown where I grew up, one of the best routes for the transit agency connects the local university with downtown and the mall. And all those communities in between have good transit access as a result of those activity nodes. Imagine if that gets flooded with automated vehicles. That makes the opportunities for transit to run on time much more difficult because congestion would go up. It also means that those transit agencies would have lower fare box revenue, which will lead to reduced transit service. So we also need to educate the community about the impact it could have on existing public services like transit So we could deploy this in a way that could strengthen communities, strengthen public transportation, lower housing costs, and lower out-of-pocket costs. Because one of the things that could happen from AVs, we could actually have the cost of using a TNC, which is an Uber or Lyft-like service, drop by up to 80%. That is, in fact, if the cost saving is transferred to the user and not simply going to the company that is deploying it. Once again, this is where community organizations have a great deal of power to assert themselves in this process to say we want to have equitable ways to make sure that everyone benefits from the technology.
Thank you for that, Mr. Gisby. Great. Would I like to follow up on what Mr. Gisby said?
I think Mr. Grisby makes a very good point about the role of local zoning in general. I mean, so here we're talking about the potential impact of, autonomous vehicles in reducing, say, parking restrictions and things of that nature. I mean, what this sort of speaks to in potentially the role of community organizations is that the nature of local zoning control on all aspects of sort of housing policy needs to be revised, right? And so I think he makes a very good point that autonomous vehicles can serve as a potential touch point for actually pushing against some of these entrenched sort of local interests. And I think that would be a very good thing in general for society and equity when it comes to sort of neighborhoods where Blacks have traditionally been excluded, in reducing housing costs. So I think that's a very important idea.
And I'd like to also add that underlying all of this is infrastructure investments. And so right now we have a large conversation happening in Congress around an infrastructure bill. Where are these investments going to be targeted? Because from a technological point of view, as Dr. Harper brought up, the need for autonomous deployment to be effective, the sensing of it, but then also from an equity point of view, we know that infrastructure investments have been historically underfunded in Black communities specifically. Public transit has been divested from in Black communities specifically. And so when we have these large infrastructure conversations, in order for one, there to be equity in transportation, and then two, the equitable deployment of these new technologies, we need for there to be equitable investment. And so we need to really push policymakers to target investments in Black communities. And I know that the currently, what is it now called? The bipartisan infrastructure framework, I think is the latest name for it, is a component is that equitable investment, but we really need to talk about what do infrastructure investments in Black communities look like. We don't even have streetlights. What are we going to do with autonomous vehicles? We don't even have access to buses like we need to. How are we going to have access to autonomous vehicles? And so we really need to talk about what are we putting in Black communities? How are investments being targeted to Black communities to actually serve us, to actually be able to access grocery stores, healthcare, employment. So I think underlying all of this before we can even get to autonomous deployment is, do we even have the infrastructure investments that we need?
I think that there's a lot of tech solutionism in Silicon Valley. And so this is exactly what happens. So the companies working on autonomous vehicles are in the Bay Area, right? And we barely have a functioning, we don't have like really a functioning train going from the Northern California to Southern California. This is technology from, a long, long time ago. And just having a functioning public transportation would do a lot. People in tech companies like to talk about, before we got to the train stations, Elon Musk was talking about this I don't even know, this tunnel, and I don't know what it was called, but this attitude is really gets to me, because it really is about policy. And if we don't have exactly streetlights, how do we expect that automated cars are gonna make life better for all of us. When has that ever happened historically, that the next technological creation has, sidestepped the wealthy or whatever and has gone directly to the people who are directly underserved? So we can't expect that to happen without strengthening the institutions that we currently have and the policies that we need for things that already exist.
Mhm. Exactly. I'll go with a follow-up question, and this can be for anybody. Dr. Jabru, and you just said about what are what are some examples, if there are, of technology bypassing the wealthy and going directly to the communities that most in need. Are there examples? Because I'm sure people who are interested, they hear that what you said, and they're like, yeah, anytime. We've had cell phones and all that. It always usually starts at the expense level, and the people who can afford it are the ones who are wealthy and afford it, and then it eventually goes down. But a lot of times with that, it only doesn't go directly to the people who are most in need. So are there examples, and anybody can comment on this, are there examples where technology has been targeted to the communities most in need and kind of bypassed wealthy, or it's just that's something that in our capitalist system that we have in the United States, it just hasn't been seen before?
I guess my first question is, can you develop a technology and just bypass some of the wealthiest people in society? I mean, usually when a technology first comes out, it's new, and I mean, there's a high price tag on it. And as the technology advances, they're able to produce a lot of the components at a cheaper cost, and then you start to see more people adopting it due to economies of scale. But I guess I don't know if you can, because I mean, if I can afford it, then somebody wealthier than me can definitely afford it. Unless it's in limited quantities and you don't allow them to get it, and only I can get it because I'm in a certain income bracket. But I guess the question is, I don't know. I haven't seen that, and I'd be interested to hear if there is a technology like that.
I'll just really quickly chime in. I think that we take that as a given, that when a new innovation comes, it's first going to be extremely expensive, and so only a few people are going to get it, and then it'll be economies of scale. I'll let the economists talk about that, so I'll stop there. But I think there have been examples where, for instance, in the coronavirus, the vaccine production, there were some labs who talked about not getting support, even though they had methodologies to produce vaccines very, very cheaply, and that would have helped way more countries in the world than is doing now. So that's one example where they had to innovate and how to help a lot of people at the and they were able to innovate, but they didn't get support. So that's just one example I can give.
I just wanted to chime in. I think in some respects, I guess I look at it as an economist slightly differently. I think the question is how do we accelerate dissemination, right? I mean, primarily because, like you said, new technologies cost a lot of money. It's a lot of R&D. That's often not the intention, especially at the private sector level and in our society, in which we've sort of agreed as a society that price is going to be the rationing mechanism, and that's going to be the primary incentive to get people moving. Then they're going to want to make profits, right? And so the way to accelerate the dissemination of technological advances and innovations and ensure a little more democratization in who has access to these technologies is to try to provide incentive for private companies to accelerate the dissemination of that stuff. And one way we could do that, I mean, this is where again, federal policy can play a role, right? Even though the federal government isn't the one necessarily, inventing all these new technologies, they actually support many of these technologies. And so part of that is that they could, build into these sort of grants and contracts, some sort of mechanism for faster dissemination. They can subsidize and provide more incentives or tax credits and things of that to kind of provide the incentive, because the private industry is going to do as private industry does, right? It wants to maximize profits. It's not necessarily going to take in the public interest. And this is the role of a functioning, so federal government, to actually sort of speed that up to ensure equitable. I'm not an advocate for federal intervention in everything, but almost every R&D advancement in our society has some involvement of the federal government. And so to me, I think we should take our legislators should take a look at that and say, well, how can we accelerate the dissemination of these things that would make people better off? So, and I think the example of vaccines, for example, were, could have been we could have had an even faster or more, a more impressive rollout. I mean, even it's been impressive to this point, but I mean, in terms of, worldwide, as treating vaccines as a public good for precisely the reasons Dr. Jabroom just mentioned. And I think, again, as we've seen in these negotiations, these international negotiations about vaccines, public policy plays a role here on whether we're going to disseminate this public good worldwide and help people out and actually reduce some of the death and suffering that we see. And it just highlights, again, the importance of public policy as a parallel, partner with private industry for getting a lot of the things that we need as a society.
I just want to add to that and emphasize the role of government and tie it to a comment that was said earlier around the deploying autonomous vehicles as public shared electric mobility options. And so, as mentioned, it was our public dollars that funded a lot of the research and development of autonomous vehicles through grants to research institutions and other companies. So since our public dollars funded it, it's the responsibility of public government to therefore make sure that it is deployed equitably and there is access to it. And so that's why I think it's important, as was mentioned earlier, to deploy it as a public shared electric mobility option, as something that supplements public transit, and to make sure that government says we are going to increase investment in public transit systems, and then only complement them with these technologies. Government does have the authority to do that. Government does have the funds to do that. And so it needs to have a prioritization of investments. And so I think that the role of government in having this conversation for the CBCF today is important to make sure that government is, again, proactive in the introduction and rollout of these technologies to make sure they're introduced in the way that will serve particularly Black communities, which is as a public transit option. We have to remember that Black people are the least likely to own a car. So we're not going to be the ones that buy autonomous vehicles. And we are the ones who disproportionately are public transit riders. And so we need to make sure that our investments are in public transit and that these technologies complement public transit. And that is the role of and power of public government to do that.
I think one of the best ways to leverage that is to come up with a political grand bargain with labor to ensure a just transition. We talked about bus drivers earlier. One of the best ways to make sure that this is deployed to our communities also, in addition to these fleets of shared electric vehicles, is to deploy it in public transportation, because there are bus lanes that are great separated that would be great for this deployment. We've got to make sure we take care of the bus drivers and other employees first. So we need to bargain with labor to ensure their transition.
Thank you, Mr. Musabin. Great comments from everybody. And I know, as being someone in the space and talking to people, they have these same questions you're talking about. They're like, yeah, we understand that this technology is coming, but how do we deploy it in a way that, as you said, as Dr. Patrice said, promotes equity, puts it as a priority, puts it in a way that actually supplements public transit? Because as you said, Dr. Patterson, we are communities disproportionately the ridership for public transit. And if we don't support our public transit system and we, see this kind of natural progression of autonomous vehicles kind of taking over our transportation system, we're going to have so many more problems, as Mr. Crispy said, with increased congestion and increased pollution and all these things, especially if we don't really focus on the electrification of these new technologies. We're going to bring in more problems and then we already have, and that's the last thing we want to do, especially in the infrastructure system. We have enough problems as it is with the status of infrastructure, we need to be helping to solve and bring more solutions instead of providing more problems. So I really appreciate the comments, especially on this question. I think a lot of people who are in the space are interested in how we practically promote equity within our transportation system. Technology as a component of that. We have time for one last question, and usually when I do these sessions, I like to have one last question where everybody can a 30-second rapid fire set of thoughts. And so we'll do that before we close our session. So this question is for everybody. Please take 30 seconds, or you short if you can, to share your response. And this question is, what is your vision of an equitable transportation future that includes AVs? And we'll start with Dr. Jibril. Go down the line.
Okay, I think I'm the least qualified to answer this, but my vision would be a transportation system that allows for public transit, that allows for people to not have really long commutes, that to reduce homelessness so they can work in locations where there are jobs, to have drone deliveries of supplies in remote locations for hospitals, etc. So that would be the kind of future that I'd like to see.
Dr. Casey, to you.
Yeah, I guess I'll echo that point. I think, one of the key themes that, sort of went around the conversation today is the importance of public goods, right? And so I, as a strong believer of public goods, I think whatever that our future, this equitable future that involves autonomous vehicles, I think there is definitely a push for, or definitely a need for autonomous vehicles to be to fit into our public goods infrastructure. And what I hope is that we will build some of the other institutions around those autonomous vehicles to ensure not only sort of they're efficient and relatively cheap and accessible to people, but also they help promote equitable outcomes, whether there be employment, health, and so on.
Thank you. Mr. Grisby, your thoughts?
I would say that my vision would be a transportation system, public transportation system that is inclusive of these fleets of shared electric vehicles, that is seamless and provides the same level of convenience and spontaneity that you get from the private automobile.
Dr. Patterson?
I'd say, it's funny, your truck's going by right now. So I would say that one, my answer centers public transit, and then autonomous vehicles are just something that supplements and complements that. And I do just quickly want to touch back on the point that Mr. Grisby brought up around labor. This transportation equity future must make sure that there is a just transition for labor, including all of our drivers, particularly bus drivers. And I will highlight that there was a case in Columbus after receiving a grant that had a pilot program on autonomous vehicle from the federal government. Their union actually won an agreement that even though they would have this autonomous vehicle, the bus driver would still be there, in recognition that bus drivers are more than just drivers. They're the ones that protect safety. They're the ones that make sure that if anything happens on the bus, they're the ones that are able to kind of navigate those kind of situations. So I just want to emphasize that drivers are more than just drivers. And so this just transition must recognize that in how we kind of reimagine labor in transportation. So an equitable transportation future has to be a just transition that also recognizes that drivers are more than drivers.
And on to you, Dr. Harper.
Sure. So let's see, an equitable transportation system to me is one that's multimodal. So buses, bikes, personal delivery vehicles, as well as autonomous vehicles shared. One that's safe. I don't think you can have a sustainable urban or rural environment if people are always constantly getting into crashes, or if an autonomous vehicle can't recognize a Black person. I don't think that's a sustainable system that should be deployed, one with complete streets to kind of facilitate a lot of this multimodal transportation, and one where we have the policies in place to ensure equitable outcomes and some equity metrics. Usually when you're piloting or something, you have to have an evaluation plan, right? We need to develop some evaluation plan and some goals, and hopefully we can reach those goals.
Thank you. Great. Well, again, thank you all for your wonderful comments and insights during this panel session. And I want to thank you to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for inviting me to moderate this session. I think it's a topic that I'm very passionate about. And of course, our panelists have shown in the various ways and our places where they work and do. This is a topic that's passionate to them. And again, I think this is a great conversation, and I look forward to seeing what people really will say and think about it. So thank you. We'll then turn it over to Dr. Patrice Johnson, who will close us out. So Dr. Johnson, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our esteemed group of panelists who truly provided us with a wealth of knowledge and information that I hope we can take and activate in our communities. We would also like to just recognize Representative Rochester for joining us for this session, her time, her valuable information. And then finally to Dr. Reagan Patterson for facilitating the conversation and getting us to really dialogue about equity in transportation. And thank you all for joining us for ALC 50. I hope that you'll enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Oh,